Welcome and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. For those who might be joining for the first time, we are a nonprofit organization, and we're based in New York, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. And we do that in a number of ways, but one of which are these discussions that we have online, where we're really trying to go a few levels below the headlines in different topics that are shaping the world today geopolitically. And we're very excited to have two wonderful speakers today. Unfortunately, our third couldn't make it because of sickness, to talk about a feminist foreign policy. So first of all, we have Spogmay Ahmed, and she is the senior policy advisor for the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, where she helps to manage the global partner network for feminist foreign policy and the Coalition for a Feminist Foreign Policy in the United States. And she provides policy and advocacy expertise for civil society, governments, and multilateral organizations. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Jennifer Cassidy. She is a diplomatic scholar at the University of Oxford, where she lectures on diplomacy and international law, digital diplomacy, and gender in diplomacy. So welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for being here today. I think we should have a very interesting conversation that might be new to some of us. So thank you for coming. I'm going to start with you, Spogmay, in a place where I usually like to start, which is getting everybody on the same page. So how would you define a feminist foreign policy, and what makes it different from a traditional foreign policy approach?
Sure. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. Your question on defining feminist foreign policy is a really important one, and it's one that we have grappled with really early on in our advocacy. So as you mentioned, in my capacity, I help manage the work of two coalitions, the Global Partner Network for Feminist Foreign Policy and the Coalition for a Feminist Foreign Policy in the United States. So early on in our advocacy, following consultations with over 100 feminist activists and more than 30 countries, we worked in coalition to delineate a definition that encapsulates what we believe are the core principles of feminist foreign policy. So it's a little bit long, so bear with me, but the definition that we acknowledge is as follows. Feminist foreign policy is the policy of a state that defines its interactions with other states, as well as movements and other non-state actors, in a manner that prioritizes peace, gender equality, and environmental integrity, enshrines, promotes, and protects the human rights of all, seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominated power structures, and allocates significant resources, including research, to achieve that vision. Feminist foreign policy is coherent in its approach across all of its levers of influence, anchored by the exercise of those values at home, and co-created with feminist activists, groups, and movements at home and abroad. So I'll note that this is not the only definition of feminist foreign policy, as other civil society advocates, governments, and researchers have proposed their own understanding of the term. However, many of these core elements are shared, primarily the commitment to human rights and gender equality, adequate representation and shared decision-making with feminist civil society, intersectionality and inclusion, the need to resource this agenda, and of course, coherence across all elements of foreign and domestic policy, among others. So feminist foreign policy is a much more progressive and people-centered approach to foreign policy. In many ways, as an advocate, I'm really hoping to influence the very same institutions that I am a product of. I studied foreign policy and international relations in the United States, and I struggle to say that my education really embraced feminist values despite its ultimate aim to nurture leaders and public servants. Traditional foreign policy assesses states' capacity to preserve power and security, often interpreted as economic and military might in their relationships with other states. While there are many theories that conceptualize foreign policy and international relations, and I know the panel can better articulate much of this than I can, traditional viewpoints often see states and non-state actors as self-interested parties operating in an intricate balance of powers. And for Western wealthy nations that often dominate foreign policy discussions and decision-making, in many ways, traditional foreign policy is a preservation of the status quo world order. So feminist foreign policy, with all due respect, challenges the status quo in pursuit of greater peace and equity. It broadens the concept of security to more comprehensively address human dignity, rights, and well-being, as well as the interlinkages between peace, conflict, disaster, climate change, and other issues. Contrary to traditional viewpoints, feminist foreign policy calls out the patriarchal and colonialist legacies of the international world order. It asks those same Western wealthy nations to recompense for actions that have created harm, to work directly with affected communities in their decision-making, and to reflect and iterate upon all aspects of their foreign policy, from peace and security, to trade and immigration, to development, and so on. That being said, feminist foreign policy is not just for the Western and the wealthy. Increasingly, governments from various regions of the world are demonstrating interest and leadership in feminist policymaking and are setting an example for centralizing human rights and intersectionality in their global engagement. So I'll end by highlighting what is one of my favorite things about feminist foreign policy, which is while we have definitions and frameworks and core principles, in feminist foreign policy, processes are just as important as outcomes. And processes can and should be changed according to context and improved with innovation. So while feminist foreign policy transforms the way that we think about foreign engagement and multilateralism, it also leaves a door open for feedback, engagement, debate, and continual improvement.
Thank you. That was a fantastic setup, and also gave a lot of food for thought for other questions down the road. I'm going to turn to you, Jennifer, because as Spogmay mentioned, there's a process within feminist foreign policy, and two, the definition is one that is, while elements are shared, not all of them are. And so I'd be curious to get your response to that. What would you agree largely with what Spogmay said? Are there other elements that you think should be a part that haven't been articulated?
Yeah, and thank you also so much for having me here. And I don't want this to be just high-fiving each other, but I just thought that was the perfect definition and just so well said, and such a wonderful definitional framework. But I don't want the whole hour to be like, oh, just all of us high-fiving each other saying, yeah, we did so well. But I agree with like everything that was said there. So these are just additional thoughts there, not disagreements on it. Just some more kind of shortened captions almost that we see of feminist foreign policy being one of the quotes that I like to use as saying it's a practical tool and a necessary perspective in order to contribute to change and help shape the current global order. So like a practical tool and a necessary perspective. And I know Sweden now has it's not the forerunner as we know it, but back in 2014, when I was researching this and studying this, Sweden was, as we know, 2014 was the only country who had it, so they were the pioneers of it. And their definitional framework of it, I think, is one that if people wanted to take home anything, just kind of a short and snappy thing, there are three things of the three R's: rights, resources, and representation. So when they're engaging with their foreign policy and their foreign policy actions with other countries, they make sure that the women's rights are being respected within the region and all those who they're dealing with. This is not always done, we have to note, by the countries that have a feminist foreign policy. We'll get to that with the critiques, but this is the definitional framework. So rights, representation, making sure that when they are engaging, having in negotiations, and not just, it's my biggest bugbear, not just in peace negotiations, that women are just brought to the table for at peace negotiations, at trade, at defense, at disarmament, at all levels of security. They're not just seen as the peace negotiators. I think, thankfully, in the last 15 years, this is somewhat changing. We're seeing more women on the first security panel in the UN. So this is wonderful. And then resources, ensuring that women of all communities within and the NGOs and the actors and the key actors on the ground of the nation state that you're dealing with, they have the right resources. So it's all very context specific. So it's not, we'll get to this regarding the critique, it's not an imposition of your viewpoint on this. It is very much a fundamental view. But we do have to note that there is a lack of a coherent definition worldwide. So there's no international treaty or legislation which lays out what a feminist foreign policy is. And this might be, I don't know, somewhat contentious to say, but I don't know whether an agreed upon feminist foreign policy definition, this is something we can maybe ask, like discuss in the Q&A, is something that we should all be working towards, maybe at a base level. But foreign policy is by its very nature a different perspective on each country's view of the world. And while there is, as I said, as rightly Spogmay said, there's their basic fundamental human rights respect, and you don't want to be dealing with countries who don't have that. I'm wary of having a foreign policy that is just completely overarching, structured, and then you do have the issue of an imposition of a foreign policy and an almost combined foreign policy. But
very interesting point. Thank you. Jennifer, just sticking with you for a minute. Could you bring this down to earth and let us know which countries in reality are currently implementing a feminist foreign policy, and what are some of the differences in their approaches, who has been successful? And then you also mentioned the case of Sweden, which I think many people know, we're one of the first countries, if not the first, I think, to adopt a feminist foreign policy, and then they've backtracked on that.
So, and I'm more than happy. It thankfully is changing quite rapidly. So I'm more than happy to be corrected if there is a country I have missed regarding this. Sweden still, they have revoked it, but 2000, just regarding, I think it's worth noting, although they have backtracked on it, the difference is, so Sweden was very much, their feminist foreign policy was very much focused on international human rights and the UN Charter. So that was very much what their feminist foreign policy is focused on. So Canada, where I currently am at the moment, they are more actually very much what this event is like. They are very devoted to, a large part of their policy is devoted to discussing how better to harness the private sector in creating these aims and objectives. So that's a very, very different approach to Sweden's, and it's worked quite well, particularly, as I said, getting the perspectives out that women are not just peace negotiators, right? Trade, finance, business. So that has, I think, Mexico, I believe it was 2020, they adopted it, and we'll get into the critiques after. We won't go there, but they're more focused on the positive side. They're more focused on the representation aspect. So they really see it as increasing more women in their foreign ministry, and they don't really highlight other aspects. They may in time. It's only 2020. Spain also is very broad based. It is they go on the 3 R's in particular as well, and increasing more women in the foreign service. France doesn't explicitly have a feminist foreign policy, does have a very strong underlying commitment to this a feminist agenda, but they don't explicitly state it. Same with the UK, with the G7 summit and their creation. We can speak about that later, but they have done a lot of work in what you would see if they had a feminist foreign policy. You would say, wow, this is what they're doing. Look at this wonderful stuff they've been doing in these realms. Now, we won't get into the other stuff, but we look at the other stuff they've been doing in this realm, but they just don't explicitly say it. So that's something to note, that some countries have, set it on at a base level, and some countries explicitly say feminist foreign policy.
Thank you.
And so the primary differences.
Spogmay, turning back to you, what would you say makes a feminist foreign policy relevant today? And is there something about this particular moment that calls for a new approach?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I really believe feminist foreign policy is more necessary today than ever. The past few years have shown us that the intersections between conflict, climate change, COVID-19, migration, and disaster are particularly damaging to women, girls, structurally excluded populations, and those who are facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. And recent statistics make this really clear. For example, 11 million girls were put at risk for permanently dropping out of school due to COVID-19 related closures. In just the first year of the pandemic, 12 million women lost access to family planning services, and 1.4 million unintended pregnancies occurred in low and middle income countries. Mid last year, over 100 million people were displaced from their homes due to violence, disaster, conflict, and persecution. And unfortunately, I could go on. Many of you are also likely familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which laid out a set of social, economic, and environmental goals that are to be achieved by 2030. But 2030 is just 7 years away. And only this month, a few weeks ago, the UN Secretary General explained that under current conditions, gender equality is 300 years away. So it's a very stark difference from the ambitions that we've laid out and the current state of the world today. It should also be noted that amid the conditions of today's world, the anti-rights movement is also really on the rise. Globally, there is a backlash to gender equality and to gender-related issues, which is well-funded and is also well-organized. And these dynamics make this agenda more difficult, but also presents a collective call that also shows us that a collective call for human rights is more necessary now than ever. Feminist foreign policy prioritizes something called co-creation, which is a concept that I really respect and hope for. It's the practice of working alongside civil society, feminist movements, and affected populations in making decisions about foreign policy. So it may seem like a sudden shift from our ways of working, but I can't imagine a more necessary way of working. In feminist foreign policy, you have to engage directly with the people who these policies are impacting. So I really challenge us to think about how the world would look different if feminist foreign policy, perhaps not in name, but even just in practice, was implemented years ago. How would the world look different today? Would we be dealing with all of these multiple and overlapping crises? And I think really just take a moment to sit with that thought and see how you could imagine a more different world.
Thank you. Kind of jumping off of that point about the feminist foreign policy and name versus practice, I turn to you, Jennifer, to talk about whether or not what connections you see between gender and leadership. And I realize we're getting into a realm that has a lot of stereotypes in it. But I'm curious, how does having a specific approach, that actual in name to integrating principles of feminism impact the larger systems in which they operate? So, is there a difference between, feminism in name and in practice? And, what role does gender and leadership, are there connections between that?
Yeah, so I'll just take the leadership question first. And I know they're somewhat very intertwined, both questions, but I'll take the leadership aspect because one of my core beliefs, and obviously everyone's beliefs are challenged left, right, and center. No one knows if their belief is the true truth, but one of my core beliefs is that I don't speak about gender and diplomacy, despite the book being called that, but I was too scared to speak up to the publisher. So I speak about the gender of diplomacy. And what I mean by the gender of diplomacy, I mean that diplomacy itself historically has always viewed women as the otherization of women, like kings, emirs, princes, prime ministers, governments, representatives, and their envoys, the world has historically been produced and constructed by men for men, and that is how diplomacy itself was created. And however, when I say the gender of diplomacy, and I'm looking at the traits of these ambassadors or these leaders, I make it very, very clear that this is not a man, particularly now, a man versus or men versus women issue. This is that the structure promotes the values of what they see as masculine values, of what they deem to be masculine values. And this is not just me theorizing. This is years of research, through foreign ministries and ambassadors, all quantitatively mapped. So women who are promoted, and so I quantitatively mapped the top 40 OECD countries and seeing where they're ambassadors around the world. So it's not just if a foreign ministry says, oh, we have an increasing number of ambassadors, I get to say, like, now, but where are they? Because if you look, they're not getting the positions of power. They're not getting Washington. They're not getting Geneva. They're not getting Brussels. They're not getting the UN. And then my Irish counterparts, I still get on very well. So they never mind me telling this story. But my first boss, she was an amazing woman, Ambassador Anne Anderson. And when I gave this talk at the Foreign Ministry, I said that exact same thing, all these things. And they said, oh, but Jennifer, we've had a woman to all those countries, ambassador woman. And I said, but it was the same woman. I was like, it doesn't count if you're just rotating the same woman around the top postings. And they were like, oh, we forgot you worked for us. I was like, yeah, I know. But you're seeing, so that's one issue that you get statistics of. There's an increase in leadership in women, but where are they being placed? And the second issue of leadership, particularly regarding diplomacy, and this matters then for who is becoming the leaders and the agenda making setters and the ones with diplomatic prowess. At the junior level, women are 45% less likely to be posted to what the 40 OECD countries deemed a conflict or war zone region. Now, they don't give a reason for this. This is just, and I think we can gather why they think that. And why that matters is because these are seen as promotional postings. It's seen as putting in your time. So if you are not given that posting at the beginning of your career, you're already on the back burner. You're already at the early stage in your career to progress. So it's not just that there's amazing women at deputy ambassadors and they don't pick them for ambassadors. It starts at the very start of the intake. So that's one issue of leadership, but it goes, and I just want to quickly make the point that this goes for men too, that when men don't display the qualities that the gender of diplomacy sees as those which make diplomacy best, they are also hindered. The men are also hindered in this. They don't get promoted. And there's just one quote that Harold Nicholson, and I know it off by heart because it's so disturbing, but Harold Nicholson said about women in diplomacy, and this is not too long ago, but he said, women, quote, women are prone to the qualities of zeal, sympathy, and intuition, which, unless kept under the firmest control, can be dangerous qualities in international affairs, end quote. And so, in my opinion, zeal, quality, and intuition are pretty good qualities in diplomacy, whether by a man or a woman. But this is the type of thing. So that's the leadership aspect. As I said, I could go on about this, so I'll stop. But the other sub part of the question, or would you like to go? Will I answer the other part of the question, or will we go back?
Yeah, why don't you answer the other question and then I'll come back.
Yeah, quickly. Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. So the other one was regarding the differences in should we just, is it the name or the should we be explicitly saying it?
Right. What
Yeah.
I think my question there is, does it matter if you actually have, what is the rationale for having an actual feminist foreign policy, as Spogmay mentioned, there's, what would things have been like if things had been implemented in practice, even if not in name. And
Yeah.
so the push
So I
to
thought that was
have it done in name as well, is that because of these
Yeah.
systems that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I just thought that line that Spogmay said was brilliant. I was like trying to write it down. That what would have been like even if we hadn't done it in name. Now this may it is controversial in the feminist foreign policy arena, and I'm on a board for the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. So clearly I'm very pro this. However, I'm also a very, very strong pragmatist. And I've just, I had mentioned to you that I've just going to finish a 10,000 word paper, because my specialty is tech and diplomacy. So I've just finished a 10,000 word paper looking at feminist foreign policy and how it's promoted online by the Ministries of Foreign Affairs. So that's going to be out in the handbook, Oxford handbook on digital diplomacy. And what I found was, and we know Twitter can be a dark place, but as a public diplomacy tool, and this was, again, this is not theorizing, this is strong quant stats coding every tweet. I think there was maybe 3 or 4 tweets out of up to like 1,700 that were positive when promoting the feminist policy. Feminist foreign policy, that was my watch, sorry. Feminist foreign policy online. So as a pragmatist, I think, okay, what's my ultimate aim? What do I want to get done? I want to get all these things achieved. Do I need to say it then? If the backlash is going to be, that might seem cowardly, I'm just being completely honest here. Like, this is my viewpoint. I'm not speaking for anyone else on this. But if I want all these things to be ticked, and they can be ticked like they are with France, who don't say it as much in their MFA, and they don't get the backlash, and my objectives are achieved, well, then my objectives are achieved. And so do I really need to use it as this public diplomacy tool? And we see this very much with Mexico. They're using it as this strong public diplomacy tool while they have these huge blind spots in their domestic context. So I think it's okay to, and I think maybe more people should say today, I don't know at this moment, right? I don't know whether we should explicitly name it. Some of my best colleagues would say to me, no, we need to name it. Some say don't, and I'm on. I have to be honest, I'm on the fence just from the data I saw, and also who I am as a diplomat and academic. That's just my viewpoint on it.
Yeah, I'm curious actually. Before I had a couple questions for you, Spogmay, but I'd love if you wanted to respond to that, because I think it's a really interesting quandary. Is it worth the backlash?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that comes up for us quite often as we work very closely with governments who are interested in this agenda, who already have established this agenda. And something that comes up often is that we tell them, if you claim feminism, if you adopt this term, then you will be committing to a higher standard, and we will hold you against that standard. So if a government is not ready to say feminist, if they fear it will cause more backlash than progress in their country context, then they do not need to be explicit about it, but we do encourage them to embrace feminist practices across their policy making, since what matters really at the end of the day is the substance and the content of this work and the impact that it has on communities. And one of the main criticisms, I know we're going to get to that in the next part of the conversation, is really that feminist foreign policy is what we call pinkwashing, or that it is just governments' efforts to look good on an international stage, to claim that they are using progressive language, that they're feminists, that they're on top of the latest trends and all. But it's my job and many of our jobs to tell them that if you're going to adhere to this term, it also means you're going to have to do the work. And if you're not ready to do that, then you don't have to do it yet. And we have established a feminist foreign policy framework, which is a document I could also link in the chat, which has a section at the very front exactly on this. It's a page on whether the word feminist is necessary in this space or not. And then the rest of the document lays out several core principles for what feminist foreign policy looks like in practice.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. We just mentioned some of the critiques. I'd love to, Spogmay, get your take on what some of the critiques are of a feminist foreign policy and how would you respond to them?
Yeah, so first and foremost, of course, is the pinkwashing critique that I just mentioned. Other critiques that we encounter are that it's too much of a Western concept, because a lot of Western countries claimed this agenda early on several years ago, but I argue that that's not true. Feminist foreign policy is still taking shape. There's still an opportunity to form this agenda. This is still relatively new in the global context, and it takes inspiration from feminist leadership and scholarship from all over the world, including the global South. There are a number of feminist advocates who are active in this work from around the world, not just based in the West. And I'm happy to share some of those examples. But I think it's really a point to be made that this is a global agenda, that this is increasingly being adopted by governments in Latin America, in Asia, in non-European and non-North American contexts, where it's being shaped by feminists on the ground and across different contexts. Another criticism is that it's too ambitious. Many people hear these terms and they say, when will this ever happen? Why would governments ever say feminist? But I think working as an advocate in this field has taught me that nothing is impossible. We often encounter a lot of resistance, and the resistance is sometimes feels more common and more burdensome than the successes do. But it's been really amazing for me to see that now over a dozen governments are claiming feminist foreign policy, that even a body like the G7, which is the world's wealthiest countries, was formed on really a basis of exclusion. Last year in their communique, they adopted the term feminist development, foreign and trade policies. And for a body like the G7 to do that, I think at one point would have been unimaginable, but is such a prime example of how this agenda does have an audience and is taking shape. Other things I think Jennifer touched upon earlier is that it really lacks coherence. Again, that's our job as advocates, to push governments to implement feminist practices across all elements of foreign policy. So when I say that, I mean peace and security, defense, immigration, trade, climate change, development and aid, and also that it's coherent with their domestic policies as well. So this comes about oftentimes when governments announce feminist foreign policies, feminist activists in their own countries say, wait, you are not implementing these values at home. They should say that. It's a rightful criticism, and it's important for that to be raised. And then lastly, we've already talked upon the critique that this is not a long-lasting and sustainable policy approach, which is, I think, a question and discussion that is worthwhile having, especially with the case of Sweden. But as I said, feminist foreign policy is still taking shape. There are still opportunities to influence this agenda. We can also look at strategies that help institutionalize feminist policymaking in things like legislation. We focus a lot on structural change, and things like that are not as easy to reverse as some policies and practices are. So really just encouraging more discussion and exploration and research around those topics. But I think lots of criticisms, but I think that we're a strong voice, and a lot of this work is yet to be developed and will be taking shape in the years to come.
Thank you so much for that. Jennifer, would you add anything to that, to the critiques?
All the critiques, again, high-fiving each other, but all the critiques I very much agree with. I won't go through them, but I had them there, like the double standards. That was the first big critique, you know, with Sweden doing the arms trade with Saudi, while also saying at home, like also critiquing the women's rights issues in Saudi. That was the first big, you know, when I was speaking about it, that was the only critique there was, because there's no other country doing it. And then, as rightly mentioned by Spogmay, the domestic blind spots that, you know, I like to call them, that, and this is where it's not just when I say online, the public using it as a public diplomacy tool. It's not just people where there's bots who automatically see feminism and, you know, there's an automatic reply. It's not just that. There's as Spogmay rightly said, there's legitimate actors, legitimate advocacy groups, communities, women on the ground of those countries who are saying, hello, like you are saying, and I'm talking directly about Mexico here, you're and I've worked with a number of ambassadors of this. I'm not speaking for Mexico, but I'm speaking of what they said. You know, so you know, 11 women a day are killed by femicide, mostly by their partners in Mexico. And they're saying, you know, you're stepping up on the global stage and calling yourself a feminist foreign policy. Also, you know, Canada, the Indigenous women, there's a huge, you know, death rate. There's a huge violence against Indigenous women here, the education. And so these blind spots. So it's not just a backlash of the normal backlash on Twitter that you get when you use the word feminism. There's legitimate pains by that. And then I've already mentioned the public diplomacy thing. And then just to say on the too ambitious side, yeah, everyone's going to call things too ambitious, right? Like, so like when I started my PhD in digital diplomacy, the words didn't exist, and like I was like, well, let's just hope it exists in 3 years when this ends. So so you know, no one was using Twitter or Facebook in the General Assembly when I was there, except for a few ambassadors playing Angry Birds. They will not be named, but I just knew it was coming, and everyone's like, no, you can't do a PhD in digital diplomacy. That's not a thing. I was like, kind of think it will be a thing. And then by the end, I don't want to say I was cheering on Trump's tweets. I was not. I was certainly not cheering on Trump's tweets, but he was a walking, breathing thesis, because I looked at how diplomats use social media during times of political crisis. But that all happened within 3 years. And then I also just mentioned the case study of Ireland, where I'm from and spend, although I work in the UK, spend most, like I consider Ireland my home and live there. I can't see Ireland adopting a feminist foreign policy anytime soon. Not that we're not extremely committed to, you know, the women, peace and security agenda. We have amazing ambassadors, male and female, who are committed to this, but just one note on how fast things can move. So everyone, well, people may look at Ireland and think, oh, you're quite progressive now, and this. No. Like during my PhD in 2016, Ireland had stricter laws regarding reproductive rights in Saudi Arabia. We had the strictest reproductive laws in the entire world. So there was in no circumstance could this be, and everyone just said, this is the way it is, it's going to happen. One case out of, there had been so many cases, but one case sparked it off. And I campaigned for that. Like I was just basically like left the UK, and I was just campaign, and it passed. And then we passed the marriage thing, and that's so it is in Ireland that I don't even recognize it anymore in a wonderful way. So when people say things are too ambitious, I'm just like, look what happened to a country who for 800 years were under the church, and in 15 years people are applauding us for how progressive we are. Like it is, so too ambitious is never, even if you get just a bit under it, I think, yeah, it can be a critique, but I think it's a compliment. So yeah.
Some very good examples there. I'm turning to the Q&A box, and if you're listening and would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. We're getting a couple of questions. I'll turn to you with this, Spogmay, of some examples of initiatives that a government needs to put in place in order to have a feminist foreign policy. So where the rubber hits the road, what are some initiatives that governments can see? And if you could give some concrete examples, that would be very helpful.
Sure, that's a really great question. I think two primary examples that I think are relevant across contexts. First, of course, is civil society engagement and co-creation. So we've been asking governments to engage civil society directly in their foreign policy decision-making processes. So increasingly, as these governments have been issuing feminist foreign policies, they have been doing just that. For example, the German development policy issued a survey for civil society organizations to comment upon and to rank different priorities. They sought inputs. They've been doing various elements of consultation. The US government, I think as I mentioned, we also have a coalition for feminist foreign policy in the United States. So one example that we've highlighted in the US context, and the US, of course, does not have a feminist foreign policy, but this coalition is asking them to develop one, is that there is a new International Security Advisory Board, which brings together civil society and experts to directly advise the State Department on their foreign policy actions. And that's something that we really want to see emulated in this work. Another thing is funding. So what's been top priority for us in this work is asking governments to put their money where their commitments are. So when you still to this day, the level of official development assistance flowing to gender equality is quite low. And really asking them to fund feminist movements and civil society more directly, to offer more sustainable and direct funding, flexible funding, more long-term funding, to see that this work is supported and can be strengthened. And then we have a host of recommendations on various thematic issues. So if the audience is interested, I'll also share a link that I would love if you could send out to our paper Toward a Feminist Foreign Policy in the United States, which lays out a set of recommendations across issues like trade, immigration, defense, foreign assistance, includes a whole host of recommendations for what the US government can more concretely do within its different departments and at the executive level to implement a feminist foreign policy.
Fantastic, thank you. Jennifer, someone wants to know, where is China on this subject?
Where is China on this subject? Right back at them. I can't say that they have been vocal, let's say, to put this diplomatically, vocal on this. They haven't been outrightly against this, but Spogmay, you may know better than I in this. China has never come up in any of the research or the dialogue on this. They haven't stopped any, like, regarding large institutional voting, haven't stopped any of this, of the resolutions being passed, but there's no outward rhetoric, there's no outward narrative, there's no outward push for this. To use the word isolationist, I would use the word isolationist in this context on this issue for this, but I'm happy to be proven wrong or told otherwise.
Yes, yeah, and
but good question.
Like the Belt and Road Initiative itself is probably not.
No, and that's actually, I actually have that written down regarding a critique saying, people talk about foreign policies, that the feminist foreign policy is going to impose, this is on the critique side again, is imposing their view of that nation's view of the world on the other. But I'm like, look, not that I'm saying this is good or bad, but this is foreign policy kind of at its core. If you look at China, and I had it noted saying China's dealings in East Africa or the ports around India, and its investment in there and the Belt Road Initiative, that's their foreign policy, and that is a power structure. They're actually imposing a huge power structure, and ultimately, yes, they're creating jobs, but they are actually, if they leave, they don't. If China leaves, they don't have the job. So they're creating this unequal power structure. It's kind of neo-colonialism, quite rightly, in a sense. And the World Bank and the IMF, there we can say the same things. When Ireland and Greece and things were bailed out, we had strict rules put over us for 10 years. And so while it's not directly related to the theme of feminism, what I'm saying is these foreign policies or these institutions, this is no different. So when people say, oh, but you're doing this, I'm like, yeah, but you're not critiquing all these other people who do this as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Spogmay, we have a question. Someone is asking, can you share global examples of disrupting the racist, colonialist, and imperialist development agendas, and how have they worked? There is a lot of literature on this topic, but I have not heard of relevant and current examples where the thought has been put to practice. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would maybe point to some funding examples that I think are promising in this regard. We've seen some feminist foreign policy countries engage in exactly what I said, figuring out different mechanisms for funding. For instance, Canada established the Equality Fund, which is an interesting example of really directly supporting a feminist fund that can then disperse money to feminist movements more directly. Other things, I think the German feminist foreign policy guidelines, which were released just earlier this month, have direct language exactly on this. They mention that part of their feminist foreign policy is for Germany to revisit its colonial practices and its influence in the world. I believe they mentioned something about funding research to this extent, which is a great example of how this can be better implemented. And also, like I said, there's a lot of room for improvement and innovation in this space. So I think increasingly we're seeing governments engage in this discourse. It's firstly, I think, an incredible step that governments are even doing just what Germany has done, that they're recognizing these colonial practices and making an intentional effort to acknowledge them, revisit them, and make reforms to that end. So I think this is really an opportunity also to pitch new ideas, to get it on the agenda of these governments, and to see what other practices can really be influential in this space.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, someone would like to know, is there a correlation between female heads of state and a more favorable foreign policy for women?
Yes, there is, but there's not a strong direct correlation that is simply going by the data and the research. And I know we'd like to think, oh, yes, this is wonderful, but I think that also feeds into the gender of diplomacy. You put a female as a head of state, and they're all going to be like, just let's talk about peace, and this that feeds the narrative. This feeds this stereotyping in diplomacy, and I very much, while of course I want increased representation of women in MFAs as ambassadors all around the world, I don't want them there simply with zeal, sympathy, and intuition. I want them there as diplomats with zeal, sympathy, and intuition, and all these other qualities that make up a wonderful diplomat. But I also want men to have these zeal, sympathy, intuition, which many do and have that. But there's certainly directly to the question, yes, particularly generations previous. So when I was working in Ireland's mission to the UN in New York, there was I believe there was 11 out of the South Sudan had just joined. So I think there's 193 293. God, I should know that. Sorry. 192 countries at the time. There's 11 female ambassadors. My ambassador was one of them, and she, as I said, she was phenomenal. But what they did, they had groups together, and they had like every second week they came together, and they were from all different regional blocks, and they really were there to try and also increase the women's agenda, increase the feminist agenda on within the UN. So that collective and that kind of solidarity between the women, what I saw, was quite unique. And yeah, there is a correlation. We've never seen, what we have seen in historically, but it's mostly men creating the wars. That's because maybe women haven't been given the chance, but I don't think that's going to happen. But I don't want, my main point there is, I don't want women just to be seen as the peacemakers. It's peacemakers and peacemakers and people who can deal with, because it's trade, trade, as we discussed before, like trade, cybersecurity, tech, immigration, all these things, all these hard issues that women are historically have been pushed away from. So we want them in there seeing it through a gender lens. And so peace is usually seen through a gender lens. All these other hard subjects historically have not. So we want the kind of whole package. But that was
interesting that you bring that up. And before I get to the next question, I have a good one for you, Spogmay. But thinking of the case of Germany, right, where the foreign minister Annalena Baerbock just came forward with their feminist foreign policy, and Germany is in a very unique position because of Ukraine, correct, and what they're doing in terms of supporting the war effort there. And so just to again bring it to real life, how do you see the particular case of Germany's foreign policy within that lens?
Within the lens of, sorry, that's not me.
Well, I mean, for both of you, I'm curious to get your comments on it. In terms of being in a position of reality, where reality is Russia attacked Ukraine, Ukraine needs support, and so does Germany send lethal arms? And is that a feminist foreign policy initiative?
And so I'll just quickly say, I don't want to take up any more time before Spogmay speaks. But I will say I was there when they announced, and when the foreign minister announces in Berlin. I work a lot with the German foreign ministry because I work a lot with CFFP, and she did give a wonderful speech. And I know this is all recorded, so it's fine as I saying, but there was somewhat a dodging of that issue regarding the arms and the Nord Stream and the oil. There was, and I'm not going to critique this too hard, because I don't have an answer. If I was in that position, there's war on the doorstep. Like in Europe at the moment, the cost of living, like if you look again, we're talking about the blind spots in the domestic. We're talking about the blind spots in the domestic nations, like the cost of living crisis. It's affecting the way, and we spoke about COVID. It's affecting women in a much more disproportionate manner. Women can't, the cost of food, the heating, the Europe is, I can't describe how much of an impact the war has had on other countries. Of course, I'm not saying in any way similar to, not putting it on any level on the impact that Ukraine has suffered. But what I am saying that I can, there is an aspect of saying, okay, yes, a feminist foreign policy, that this is wonderful, but we also can't just be focused looking at the war, like women. I'm getting kind of mix up my narratives here, but women in our country also are now suffering because of this war. So there's the arms and the trade war was kind of moved to the side, and there was this huge event. But you know, the one of the biggest arms sellers. But what I will say, the last thing I will say is that it is on a public diplomacy front, particularly Germany's role in the EU, and how Merkel made her stamp, her wonderful stamp on it. It is great to have them proclaim it, because I think that there could be a domino effect of more countries adopting. I think it was done very, very well. So like regarding the public diplomacy point of view. Sorry, that I didn't really answer your question that well, because there's a lot going on. Yeah.
I know we have a little time left. Spogmay, there's a question here that says, have there existed cultural competencies and capacities that support feminist foreign policy in non-Western societies, that is, without its association with the word feminism?
That's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure what they mean by cultural competencies, but I think definitely like definitions of feminism and conceptions of that term exist in various regions, and there are local civil society and women leaders who are working in community and at local levels with local leaders, whether that be governing bodies, religious leaders, others, to really embrace kind of more of a cultural and social norm approach to this. So that may be an example to look into. I could also go back to the question you just asked and just say that this is, I think, a really interesting and prominent tension that exists in this space. When Germany released their feminist foreign policy, it very explicitly says that this feminist foreign policy is not pacifist. And I was at several discussions at the Commission on the Status of Women this month in New York, where Germany and Colombia were sharing a stage. And Colombia, in their approach to feminist foreign policy, one of their 3 core elements is that their feminist foreign policy is pacifist. Within their borders and outside of their borders, they want to stop engaging in any sort of military conflict. So it's going to, I think the harsh reality is that it's going to take Germany and other NATO members and governments a very long time to get to where Colombia is today. Of course, the context for those governments are very different. But I think a lot of feminist foreign policy advocates would say that the ultimate aim is not to just include more women in conflict settings or to address issues within conflict, but really how do we avoid conflict at all? But that, of course, is something that is going to take a much longer time to get to, but there are lots of steps that we can take in the interim to approach this question, because most feminist foreign policy advocates will say that embracing a feminist approach to foreign policy and increasing and continuous militarism are not in line with each other. So what can we do to make sure that Germany and other governments get there down the line? If it's not immediately, what are steps that can get us there in the future?
Fantastic example, and a good segue to the last question that I'll try to get in. So Spogmay, what are some commonalities, perhaps indicators that might predict readiness to adopt a feminist foreign policy? What are you looking at? And then within those countries that have adopted a feminist foreign policy, how do you move that needle forward towards one that better matches that definition that you laid out at the beginning?
That is a really great question. I think definitely we look first and foremost at leadership and political context. Does the political context within that country embrace progressive values? Would they be welcoming to embracing the word feminism? Would they be welcome to engaging with feminist movements and feminist civil society on a more substantive level? We also look at their record on human rights and gender equality. So what have they been doing over the years to promote human rights, both within their countries and on the international stage? What do their policies look like around things like immigration and trade and humanitarian assistance? How much are they funding women's rights and gender equality issues? my colleagues at the International Center for Research on Women, which I was previously working at, came out with a really interesting resource recently called the Feminist Foreign Policy Index. It's the first ever quantitative effort to look at countries' adherence to feminist foreign policy principles. So it's not examining current feminist foreign policies, but it's looking at different elements of domestic and international engagement that make things like that embrace feminist values. So I would say that countries that are ranking higher in that index, if they have not adopted feminist foreign policies, are more likely to do them. But of course, context is really important here, context and nuance, and looking at the intricacies of what that index is measuring. But I think that's an interesting example of looking at how a country's engagement might be a signal for their adoption of this kind of policy.
Right, fantastic. Well, that seems like a good place to stop because we are on the hour. I want to thank you both. Thank you so much. It was a fascinating conversation. It seems like you're both doing really interesting work that must often feel like you're running into a brick wall, but I think it's very interesting to take on a new paradigm. So with that, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for the great questions. Our next discussion is on the Balkans, so power and external influence in the Balkans. We'll be looking at the case of Kosovo and Serbia. It's free and open to everyone around the world, so please do attend or share friends and colleagues and people who are interested in discussions. And then we have a discussion, the first discussion part of our deep dive on China's long march to market. If you're not, you can scan and find out how you can participate because it's a very important discussion to have. And again, we are a nonprofit, so if you care to donate, we greatly appreciate it. So thank you, Spogmay. Thank you, Jennifer. Really appreciate it, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.